The reassignment rite began at dawn, though the sky over the siege line had not changed color in weeks. I stood in a half-buried transit chapel 20 kilometers behind the forward trenches, ledger clasped against my chest, while a Munitorum quartermaster read serial numbers from a data slate in a voice that never wavered. The air smelled of recirculated incense and lubricant. 63 men from the 44th Vraxian Auxilia stood in formation before us, their uniforms still bearing the dust of the eastern redoubts. They had been fighting for 11 months. Their regiment had been declared depleted 4 days prior. The Krieg officers entered without ceremony, 3 of them, masked and silent, carrying nothing but compliance seals already stamped with today's date. They did not salute. They positioned themselves equidistant from one another and began reciting the litany of absorption in Low Gothic, so precise it sounded like counting. The Auxilia stood at attention. Some of them were shaking. Most were not. The chapel's Vox unit crackled with static that resolved into a recorded choir, singing the cantus of necessary reduction. I had heard it before, at funerary processions where the bodies were too damaged to burn individually. The quartermaster called each auxiliary by name. One by one, they stepped forward. A Krieg attendant marked their forehead with ash, then removed their regimental insignia with a small blade that did not cut skin. The insignia were placed in a bronze bowl that would later be melted down for reclamation. Each man was handed a respirator mask, a Lazrafal with the serial number already scratched out, and a revised identification wafer. The wafers bore Krieg regimental codes. The names were gone. In their place, strings of numbers and a single word, repentant. I was there to certify continuity. My role was to ensure that the ledger reflected what occurred, that no soul was lost to clerical error, that the Imperium's accounting of its faithful remained absolute. I had performed this duty for 7 years across 4 theaters. I understood the necessity of such rites. The administratum does not function on sentiment. It functions on accuracy. When a regiment falls below operational coherence, its remnants must be absorbed by forces capable of utilizing them. The Death Korps of Krieg specialized in such absorption. They were the Imperium's solution to entropy. The rite took 40 minutes. When it concluded, I opened my ledger to reconcile the numbers. 63 men transferred, 63 men received. The math was simple. I began the tallying process, cross-referencing deployment logs against casualty reports from the previous week. The Auxilia had suffered 118 confirmed deaths in the last engagement. Their surviving strength, including the walking wounded, should have numbered 209. Reinforcements had not arrived. Attrition had been continuous. I counted again. The numbers resolved perfectly. Exactly 209 personnel accounted for. 146 remained with the depleted Auxilia, assigned to rear echelon labor details. 63 absorbed by Krieg. No discrepancies. No losses unaccounted for. I stared at the figures until the ink seemed to blur. The 118 dead were listed in a separate column, marked with the standard mortuary codes. But the living count matched deployment records from 2 months prior, before the attrition had begun. I looked up. The Krieg troopers who had received the Auxilia stood in formation outside the chapel, already integrated into a larger column marching toward the forward supply depot. The absorbed men moved identically to those who had always been Krieg. Same gait, same posture, same silence. I could not distinguish them. I returned to the ledger. The numbers were correct. Numbers did not lie. If the totals reconciled, then reality had been properly documented. The quartermaster approached me. He did not ask if I had questions. He placed a revised clearance chit on the open page of my ledger, directly over the reconciliation I had just completed. The chit bore my name, my scribe designation, and a new authorization code. It permitted me to remain attached to Krieg logistics operations for the duration of the Vraxian continuance. For continuity, the annotation read. I looked at him. He looked at the ledger. He told me my presence had been deemed beneficial to the accuracy of future transitions. He told me this was an honor. I believed him. I had been seconded to the Munitorum from the Departamento Administratum 8 months prior, when the Vraxian campaign entered its 3rd year and the demand for casualty reconciliation exceeded the capacity of standard field scribes. My training had been thorough. I knew the tarot of logistics. I had memorized the 17 approved formats for death certification. I understood that the Imperium's survival depended on knowing exactly how many souls it possessed, how many it had spent, and how many it could afford to lose before a given Jansen collapsed. This was not morbid work, it was sacred work. Every name I recorded was a life sanctified by sacrifice. Every number I tallied was a prayer in the language the Imperium understood best. I had worked in the archives on distant agri worlds where my most harrowing task was verifying tithe compliance. I had audited munitions expenditure on fortress stations where the only violence was the slow degradation of unserviced machinery. The Vraxian theater was my first frontline assignment. I had expected brutality. I had expected to witness suffering that would test my faith. What I had not expected was order. The rear echelons of the siege line were clean, methodical, and functionally silent. The command structure operated with the efficiency of a well-maintained chronometer. Reports arrived on schedule. Supplies moved along approved routes. Even the dead were processed with a precision that suggested reverence rather than haste. The death corps of Krieg formed the core of the Imperial response to the Vraxian rebellion. I knew their reputation. Every child of the Imperium knew their reputation. Krieg had committed the unthinkable sin of secession during the Age of Apostasy, plunging itself into 500 years of atomic civil war until nothing remained but ash, faith, and a debt that could never be repaid. The survivors had sworn themselves to eternal atonement. They did not fight for glory. They fought because their existence was a wound in the Imperium's trust, and only death could seal it. Krieg regiments were issued to campaigns where loss was guaranteed, where other forces would break, where victory required the kind of sacrifice that could not be asked of the redeemed. This was doctrine. This was truth. I did not question it. I did not need to question it. My role was not to judge the death corps, but to ensure their expenditure was correctly documented. The Imperium could afford to lose Krieg soldiers because Krieg had already been lost. They were a resource that existed in a state of permanent sacrifice. Their deaths were not tragedies. They were payments on an ancient debt. The system was harsh, but it was honest. Some worlds sinned. Some worlds atoned. Krieg atoned endlessly, so others might live without that burden. I found comfort in this clarity. The Imperium was vast beyond comprehension, and within that vastness, moral certainty was the only bulwark against despair. Krieg's sacrifice was terrible, but it was also purposeful. It stabilized campaigns that would otherwise collapse into stalemate or rout. It allowed the Adeptus Astra Militarum to deploy forces with the confidence that certain sectors would hold, no matter the cost. The Death Corps did not retreat. They did not waver. They absorbed entropy until the strategic picture resolved in the Imperium's favor. This was not cruelty. This was faith refined into utility. I trusted the rear. I trusted the systems that turned chaos into columns, that transformed violence into data, that ensured the Imperium could look upon its wars and know exactly what they had cost. My faith was not in the righteousness of individual commanders, nor in the invincibility of the Imperial Guard. My faith was in the ledger. If the numbers resolved, the Imperium remained whole. If the accounting was sound, then the sacrifice had meaning. I believed this with the certainty of a man who had spent his entire adult life translating suffering into script. The transit chapel stood empty by mid-morning. I remained at the small wooden table that served as my workspace, finalizing the rites documentation. The absorbed auxilia were gone. The Krieg officers had departed without offering benediction or dismissal. I was alone with the smell of ash and the distant, rhythmic thud of artillery that never quite ceased. My hand cramped from writing. I set down my pen and flexed my fingers, watching the ink dry on the page. The records were flawless. Every transfer had been logged, every signature had been obtained, every soul had been accounted for. I closed the ledger and placed it in my satchel, then stood and stretched. My back ached. I had been awake for 16 hours. My billet was a reclaimed storage bunker 3 kilometers west, accessible by a supply trench that flooded whenever the shelling intensified. I did not look forward to the walk, but I had made it many times before. Routine was its own kind of comfort. I stepped outside. The sky was the color of old bone. The air tasted of sulfur and something sharper, something that scraped the back of the throat. The siege line stretched endlessly in both directions, a topology of trenches, bunkers, razor wire, and prefabricated structures that had been temporary for so long they had acquired the permanence of scar tissue. Men moved along the trench lanes with the unhurried efficiency of those who had long since accepted their circumstances. Most were not Krieg. Supply personnel, tech adepts, junior commissars, Medicae orderlies. The Krieg formations remained forward, where the killing was constant. I began walking. The trench floor was wooden slats over mud that never dried. Somewhere ahead, a voxcaster played a scratchy recording of the Imperial hymnal. A tech priest hurried past me, muttering in binaric cant, followed by 2 servitors carrying a crate marked with hazard symbols I did not recognize. No one acknowledged me. I was part of the landscape. Scribes did not warrant salutes. I thought about the ledger. I thought about the numbers that had reconciled too perfectly. I told myself it was exhaustion distorting perception. Casualty reports were compiled by multiple sources: field medicae, regimental adjutants, commissariat observers. Errors were common. Over-reporting was standard procedure, a buffer against undercounting the dead. If the final tally matched earlier deployment logs, it simply meant the attrition had been less severe than preliminary estimates suggested. Men survived wounds that should have killed them. Soldiers listed as missing returned from isolated positions. The fog of war was thick, and clarity only emerged in retrospect. I told myself this, and I believed it, because the alternative was to believe the ledger had lied. And the ledger could not lie. The ledger was the Imperium's memory. If I could not trust the ledger, I could not trust my purpose. 3 days later, I was summoned to observe a muster inspection at Reserve Trench Epsilon 7. The order came through standard Munitorum channels, marked with the same continuity clearance I had been issued after the rite. I did not question it. Observation duties were common. The administratum valued witnesses. If a discrepancy arose, a scribe's testimony carried the weight of objectual truth. I gathered my satchel, checked that my identification seal was properly affixed to my greatcoat, and made my way to the designated location. Epsilon 7 was deeper in the reserve network than I had previously ventured. The trench system was a labyrinth, and navigation required constant reference to posted signage and the occasional guidance of military police stationed at intersections. The MPs directed me without conversation, their expressions blank beneath their helmets. I walked for nearly an hour. The trenches grew narrower. The wooden slats gave way to bare earth, then to rock, then to what looked like pre-existing tunnel work, old mining corridors that had been repurposed and reinforced with Imperial construction methods. The air changed. It became cooler, drier. The smell of the siege smoke, cordite, human waste, decay faded. I heard no artillery here. The silence was not peaceful. It was dense, oppressive, the kind of silence that suggested depth. I passed through a checkpoint manned by Krieg sentries. They examined my clearance chit without comment, then waved me forward. Beyond the checkpoint, the tunnel opened into a wide chamber carved from bedrock, lit by harsh sodium lamps that cast everything in shades of yellow and black. Krieg troopers stood in formation, hundreds of them. They faced a raised platform where a quartermaster and 2 Krieg officers conducted roll call. The quartermaster read from a data slate. The officers marked tallies on parchment scrolls. The troopers did not respond verbally. When a serial number was called, the corresponding soldier stepped forward 1 pace, then returned to position. The rhythm was metronomic. I watched from the edge of the chamber, ledger open but untouched. I was not required to record this. I was required to witness it. The formation began to shift. Troopers emerged from a secondary tunnel at the far end of the chamber, marching in columns of 4. They wore standard Krieg uniform greatcoats, respirators, combat webbing, las rifles slung across their backs. Their boots struck the stone floor in perfect unison. They joined the formation seamlessly, integrating into the ranks without verbal command or visible signal. The roll call continued without pause. The quartermaster did not acknowledge the new arrivals. He simply read more serial numbers, and more troopers stepped forward. I glanced at the tunnel mouth. It was labeled on the chamber's posted schematic as Transit Corridor Secundus. No origin point was listed. I looked back at the formation. The troopers who had just arrived bore no signs of travel, no dust, no wear on their equipment. Their uniforms looked freshly issued, but their posture suggested veterans. I counted the new arrivals. 47. I checked my internal records, trying to recall if any Krieg reinforcements had been logged in recent supply manifests. None came to mind. The muster continued for another 20 minutes. When it concluded, the formation dispersed in orderly columns, filing out through multiple exits. I remained in the chamber until it was empty except for the quartermaster and myself. He approached me. He asked if I required clarification on any procedural elements. I asked where Transit Corridor Secundus led. He told me it connected to deeper reserve staging areas. I asked if those areas were supplied through standard logistics networks. He told me all Krieg assets were managed according to approved continuity frameworks. I did not ask further questions. I thanked him and departed. I walked back through the tunnels with my ledger still open, though I had written nothing. My mind catalogued details without organizing them. Troopers arriving from unlisted corridors, serial numbers that had not been cross-referenced against deployment rosters, uniforms without variation. When I reached my billet, I sat at my small desk and opened the Master Campaign Ledger, the comprehensive document that tracked all Imperial forces assigned to the Vraxian theater. I searched for recent Krieg reinforcement entries. I found none dated within the last month. The most recent Krieg deployment had been logged 6 weeks prior. 2 understrength companies transferred from a concluded campaign in the Segmentum Obscurus. Their arrival had been documented with full transport manifests, warp transit logs, and embarkation records. Everything was in order. Everything was accounted for. The 47 troopers I had observed could not have been part of that deployment. They would have required separate documentation. I closed the ledger. I told myself I had miscounted. Fatigue was cumulative, and I had not slept well in days. The underground chambers distorted perception. Echoes created the illusion of larger numbers. The Krieg formations were so uniform that distinguishing individuals was nearly impossible. It was reasonable to mistake a reorganization for an arrival. I was not a military officer, I was a scribe. My expertise was documentation, not tactics. I repeated this to myself until it felt true. The Medicae station occupied a reinforced bunker complex near the secondary artillery emplacements. It was one of 3 such facilities serving the siege line, responsible for processing casualties from the central sectors. I had been tasked with auditing their weekly reports after a minor discrepancy was flagged during routine munitorum review. The discrepancy was insignificant, a 3% variance between reported injuries and treated personnel, but the administratum did not tolerate variance, no matter how minor. My role was to identify the source of the error and recommend corrective procedures. I arrived during the mid-shift lull. The bunker's entrance was guarded by 2 military police who checked my credentials before allowing me inside. The interior was functional to the point of austerity. Bare rockreat walls. Steel gurneys arranged in rows. Medical equipment that looked scavenged from a dozen different sources, maintained through improvisation and prayer. The air was thick with disinfectant and something beneath it, something organic and unpleasant. A Medicae attendant directed me to the records alcove, a narrow chamber lit by a single flickering lumen globe. The records were physical ledgers, supplemented by data slates for daily logs. I began cross-referencing entries. The work was tedious but familiar. I traced injury reports back to their originating units, verified that treatment logs matched casualty notifications, and ensured that discharge authorizations had been properly filed. Most of the entries were standard: shrapnel wounds, burns, concussive trauma, the expected catalogue of siege warfare. The Medicae staff had done competent work. Their documentation was thorough. I found the variants in the Krieg entries. The Death Corps wounded were listed in a separate section, color-coded with a red border to denote special processing requirements. I understood the logic. Krieg soldiers often refused treatment that would remove them from combat readiness. Their pain tolerance was abnormal. Their priorities were not survival but function. The Medicae were required to document refusals, even when those refusals resulted in death. I read the entries carefully. Over the course of the previous week, 73 Krieg troopers had been admitted with injuries classified as critical: severed limbs, catastrophic burns, perforated organs, the kind of damage that required immediate surgical intervention or resulted in death within hours. I checked the treatment logs. 41 had received surgery. 32 had been listed as refused treatment. Of those 32, 27 had died. 5 had been marked as return to strength. I stared at those 5 entries. Return to strength. The language was standard, used to indicate that a soldier had recovered sufficiently to resume duties. But the injuries listed were not recoverable. One trooper had suffered third-degree burns across 60% of his body. Another had lost both legs below the knee. A third had sustained a punctured lung and severe spinal trauma. These were not wounds that healed in a week. These were not wounds that healed at all, not without augmetic reconstruction that the Medicae station was not equipped to perform. I checked the discharge logs. All 5 troopers had been released from medical supervision within 72 hours of admission. No follow-up treatment was scheduled. No recovery timeline was projected. The notation in each file was identical. Reallocation approved. Continuity maintained. I looked up. A Medicae orderly was passing through the alcove, carrying a tray of surgical implements. I called to him. He stopped. I asked what reallocation meant in this context. He glanced at the ledger I was holding, saw the red-bordered section, and shook his head. He told me Krieg casualties followed different protocols. I asked what those protocols were. He told me he was not authorized to clarify. I asked who was. He told me to submit an inquiry through the Munitorum Liaison Office. I did not submit an inquiry. I returned to the ledger. I read every Krieg entry from the past month. The pattern was consistent. Critical injuries, minimal treatment, rapid discharge, reallocation. The word appeared again and again, always without elaboration. I calculated the percentage of Krieg wounded who died versus those who were reallocated. The ratio was exactly 1 to 5. For every 5 critically wounded Krieg troopers, 4 died and 1 was reallocated. The math was too clean. Survival rates did not follow ratios. They followed the chaos of biology, the variables of injury type, medical competence, and individual resilience. A perfect 1 to 5 split suggested design, not chance. I checked other regimental sections for comparison. The survival-to-death ratios were erratic, as expected. 15% for one unit, 34% for another, 7% for a third. Only the Krieg entries showed consistency. I closed the ledger and returned it to the filing cabinet. The Medicae orderly was gone. The alcove was empty except for the sound of my own breathing. I thought about the 5 troopers who had been reallocated. I thought about the tunnel in Reserve Trench Epsilon 7, the arrivals without documentation, the formations that absorbed new bodies without ceremony. I thought about the reassignment rite, the way the auxilia had been transformed into Krieg through ritual and paperwork, their names erased and replaced with serial strings. I thought about the ledger, and how perfectly everything resolved when I stopped asking where the numbers came from. The commissariat maintained a modest administrative office in a bunker near the command headquarters. It was staffed by 2 junior commissars who handled discipline enforcement, morale documentation, and liaison duties with the various regimental command structures. I had interacted with them occasionally during my audits, always in the context of cross-referencing casualty reports with execution records. The commissariat was meticulous about documenting summary punishments. Every bolt round fired into a fleeing soldier's skull was logged, justified, and archived. This was necessary. The Imperium's brutality was not arbitrary. It was procedural. I arrived unannounced. The junior commissar on duty was a woman named Helena Crost. She was young for her rank, her face still unlined, though her eyes carried the particular exhaustion of those who had been forced to kill men they had eaten breakfast with. She looked up from her desk when I entered. She did not smile, but she gestured to a chair. I sat. I told her I was conducting a routine audit and had encountered terminology in medical records that I did not fully understand. I asked her to clarify the meaning of reallocation in the context of Krieg casualties. She studied me for a moment. Then she stood, walked to a filing cabinet, and retrieved a thin pamphlet bound in black leather. She placed it on the desk between us. The cover bore the Munitorum seal and the words Death Corps Personnel Management Supplementary Protocols. She told me to read Section 7. I opened the pamphlet. The text was dense, written in the bureaucratic low Gothic favored by the administratum. I scanned until I found the relevant passage. It stated that Death Corps regiments operated under modified casualty management frameworks due to the unique theological and logistical considerations of their service. Standard medical triage did not apply. Wounded Krieg personnel were not classified by survivability, but by continued utility. Those whose injuries prevented immediate combat function were subject to reallocation procedures, which involved transfer to specialized continuity management facilities where their service could be prolonged through alternative means. I read the passage twice. I looked at Commissar Crost. I asked what alternative means entailed. She told me she did not have clearance to specify. I asked who did. She told me that information was restricted to senior Munitorum and Mechanicus personnel overseeing Death Corps logistics. I asked why such restrictions existed. She told me it was not her role to question policy. She told me the Death Corps was a unique instrument and unique instruments required unique maintenance. I asked if she had ever visited one of these continuity management facilities. She said no. I asked if she knew where they were located. She said they were not listed on standard theater maps. I asked how casualties were transported to them. She said she assumed through standard medical evacuation channels. I asked if she had ever seen a transport manifest for such evacuations. She said no. She closed the pamphlet and returned it to the filing cabinet. She told me that the administratum's need for documentation did not supersede operational security. She told me that the Death Corps had served the Imperium faithfully for millennia, and their methods, however inscrutable, had proven effective. She told me that sometimes faith required accepting that not all knowledge was meant to be possessed by all servants. She told me this gently, as if she were offering comfort rather than dismissal. I thanked her and left. I began to notice the repetition after that. It was subtle, the kind of pattern that only emerged through prolonged observation. I did not seek it out. I simply performed my duties, and in performing them, I saw the attrition curves. Every Krieg regiment attached to the Vraxian theater followed the same loss trajectory. During the first month of deployment, casualties remained within predicted parameters. During the second month, losses intensified as the regiment was committed to escalating combat operations. By the third month, attrition reached levels that would render any other regiment combat ineffective. But the Krieg formations never fell below operational strength. Replacements arrived with metronomic regularity, maintaining unit coherence without variance. I checked older campaign archives, records from wars fought decades prior. The pattern persisted across theaters, across continents, across centuries. The Death Corps always sustained catastrophic losses. The Death Corps always remained at full strength. The replenishment rate was not responsive to individual campaign conditions. It was fixed, as if predetermined. I cross-referenced recruitment data from Krieg itself. The planet was a wasteland, its population locked in perpetual militarized indoctrination. Birth rates were classified, but estimates suggested a total population of several billion, nearly all of whom served in some military or support capacity. The Death Corps drew from this population continuously, tithing regiments to the Imperium at a rate that should have depleted the world within a single generation. Yet Krieg had been providing regiments for over 1,000 years without reported decline in output. The numbers did not reconcile unless Krieg's population was growing at a rate that compensated for export. But Krieg was a poisoned world. Its environment could not sustain rapid population growth. Its resources were entirely devoted to military production. There was no surplus, no margin for demographic expansion. The only way the math worked was if Krieg was not replacing its soldiers through natural births, but through some other mechanism. I did not know what that mechanism was. The records did not specify. But I began to suspect that the continuity management facilities were not medical institutions. They were something else. Something that rendered the distinction between life and death procedurally irrelevant. I thought about the 5 troopers marked as return to strength. I thought about the arrivals in the underground muster chamber. I thought about the reassignment rite, the way names had been removed and numbers assigned, the way men had been transformed from auxilia into Krieg through ritual that felt less like induction and more like reconstitution. I thought about the ledger and how it always balanced, and how that balance required believing that bodies could be issued like ammunition. I stopped sleeping well. The dreams were not nightmares in the traditional sense, they were procedural. I dreamed of standing in formation, of receiving a serial number, of walking into an unlabeled corridor that descended into darkness. I dreamed of paperwork that filled itself out, of ledgers that corrected my entries before I could finish writing them, of voices reciting compliance catechisms in unison until the words lost meaning. I woke often, disoriented, unsure if I had been asleep or simply staring at the ceiling of my bunker while my mind processed what I had seen. My appetite diminished. Food became texture without taste, fuel consumed because the body required it. I continued my work with the same diligence I had always maintained. My audits were thorough. My reports were accurate. I submitted documentation on time and without error. To any observer, I was functioning normally. But internally, something had shifted. I no longer felt the satisfaction of completion when a ledger balanced. I felt only the weight of what that balance represented. I began to notice my colleagues avoiding me. Not overtly, not with hostility, but conversations ended when I approached. Invitations to shared meals became less frequent. The few other scribes attached to the theater treated me with a kind of careful politeness that suggested discomfort rather than respect. I did not blame them. I had become a reminder of something they did not wish to contemplate. The administratum functioned on willing ignorance. We documented the Imperium's machinery without questioning its design. Those who questioned became problems. I was becoming a problem. The supply depot audit was routine work. A shipment manifest had been flagged for minor inconsistencies, and I was assigned to verify physical inventory against recorded deliveries. The depot was a sprawling complex of prefabricated warehouses and open storage yards, located far enough from the front to be relatively safe, but close enough to maintain logistical efficiency. I arrived in the early morning, when the shift crews were just beginning their day. The depot quartermaster met me at the entrance. He was an older man, a veteran of supply logistics who had spent more years managing materiel than I had been alive. He walked me through the inventory sections with the weary professionalism of someone who had explained these systems 1,000 times before. We checked ammunition stores, ration crates, medical supplies, vehicle parts. Everything matched the manifests. The inconsistencies were clerical errors, minor transpositions that I corrected in my ledger. Then we reached the restricted materials section. It was separated from the main depot by a reinforced fence and a guarded gate. The guards were Krieg, They examined my clearance chit longer than the other checkpoints had, their masked faces revealing nothing. Eventually, they opened the gate and allowed us through. The quartermaster did not follow. He told me he would wait outside. I asked why. He said his clearance did not extend to restricted Krieg logistics. I asked whose did. He said mine, apparently. The restricted section was smaller than I expected. A single warehouse, its interior divided into rows of steel shelving. The crates were uniform, unmarked except for serial codes stenciled in black. I checked the manifest. The crates were listed as personnel sustainment assets, no further specification. I selected a crate at random and examined it. The seal was intact. I broke it and opened the lid. Inside were respirator components, filters, valve assemblies, replacement lenses, straps, all standardized to Krieg specifications. I checked another crate, more respirator parts. A third crate contained field ration packs, the compressed nutrient blocks issued to frontline troops. A fourth held spare uniform components, greatcoat fasteners, boot soles, belt buckles. I continued down the rows. Every crate contained items related to personal equipment maintenance. Nothing unusual, nothing that warranted restricted access. I reached the end of the warehouse and found a section that was not shelving but sealed transport coffins, the kind used to move personnel in cryostasis or medical stasis during long-range deployments. There were 37 coffins stacked in 3 rows. They were connected to a portable power generator that hummed quietly in the corner. I checked the manifest again. The coffins were listed as pre-deployment reserve assets. I approached the nearest coffin. It bore no external markings except a serial code. I hesitated, then activated the viewport panel on the lid. The interior was lit by a pale green illumination. Inside was a man. He wore a Krieg uniform. His respirator was sealed, his eyes were closed. Monitoring cables ran from his suit to the coffin's internal systems. The life sign indicators showed stable vitals. I moved to the next coffin. Another man, same configuration. I checked 5 more, all occupied, all stable. I counted the coffins again, 37. I returned to the manifest and cross-referenced the serial codes. They matched recent Krieg reinforcement logs, but the logs listed these assets as delivered to frontline units 3 weeks prior. I stood in the warehouse for a long time, staring at the coffins. The generator hummed. The life sign indicators blinked steadily. The men inside did not move. I thought about the troopers I had seen arrive in the underground muster chamber. I thought about the reallocation entries in the medical ledgers. I thought about the reassignment rite, the way bodies had been distributed like supplies. I closed my ledger. I left the warehouse. The guards did not acknowledge my departure. The quartermaster asked if I had found everything in order. I told him yes. He seemed relieved. He escorted me back to the main depot entrance and bid me a pleasant day. I walked back to my billet in silence. The artillery was louder than usual. The sky had darkened to the color of old blood. I thought about the phrase pre-deployment reserve assets and how it suggested storage rather than personnel, and how easily language could transform men into inventory. I began to understand that the Death Corps was not a military formation, it was a logistical solution. The Imperium required forces that could be deployed into grinding attrition theaters without destabilizing the broader strategic balance. It needed regiments that could absorb losses indefinitely, that did not require morale maintenance, that functioned with the reliability of manufactured goods. Krieg provided this, but the mechanism was not recruitment, it was production. The evidence was scattered across 100 fragmented records, but once I began assembling it, the pattern became undeniable. Krieg regiments were not raised in response to need. They existed in a state of perpetual readiness, maintained at fixed strength regardless of deployment status. Casualties were not replaced, they were replenished, as if the distinction between death and absence was purely administrative. The troopers I had seen in transit coffins were not reinforcements awaiting deployment. They were components awaiting installation. I thought about the medical reallocation entries. I thought about the wounded who had been marked as returned to strength despite injuries that should have killed them. I thought about the continuity management facilities that no one had ever visited, the facilities that existed somewhere in the logistics network but were never mapped, never inspected, never documented beyond oblique references in restricted protocols. I began to suspect that the facilities did not exist as physical locations. They existed as categories. Reallocation was not transport, it was reclassification. A wounded Krieg soldier was not healed. He was redesignated as raw material and fed back into the production system. The body was irrelevant. What mattered was the serial number, the ledger entry, the abstract continuity of the regiment as an operational entity. The Imperium did not see Krieg soldiers as human, it saw them as self-sustaining ordnance. They were born, deployed, expended, and reconstituted in a closed loop that required no external input beyond the initial sin that had condemned them. Krieg's atonement was not a path to redemption. It was a mechanism that converted guilt into an infinite resource. And I was part of the mechanism. Every ledger I balanced, every casualty I documented, every audit I completed reinforced the system's coherence. My work ensured that the numbers always resolved, that the illusion of accountability persisted, that the Imperium could look upon its wars and believe it knew the cost. But the cost was not real. The dead were not counted as losses because they had never been counted as lives. They were entries in a ledger that balanced itself through processes I was not permitted to see. I sat in my billet, staring at the master campaign ledger, and I understood that I had not been seconded to the Munitorum to document the death corps. I had been seconded to legitimize them. My presence, my certification, my scribe's seal transformed atrocity into procedure. As long as the records were accurate, as long as the numbers reconciled, the system could claim it was functioning according to sanctioned protocols. I was not a witness. I was a component. The realization did not arrive as horror. It arrived as clarity. I felt no outrage, no revulsion, no urge to resist. I felt only the slow, crushing weight of complicity, the recognition that my faith in the ledger had been misplaced. The ledger did not reveal truth. It obscured it, and I had spent my entire career perfecting that obscurity. I continued my work because there was no alternative. Refusing duties was not an option. The Imperium did not tolerate non-compliance, and I had no grounds for objection. I had discovered nothing forbidden. I had violated no protocols. I had simply learned what the system had always been designed to do. My knowledge changed nothing except my ability to derive comfort from my role. The audits grew mechanical. I processed reports without reading them. I reconciled tallies without verifying sources. The numbers always balanced, and I stopped caring why. My colleagues noticed the change. The careful politeness evolved into outright avoidance. I ate alone. I worked alone. When the Munitorum Liaison Office issued new assignments, I completed them in silence and submitted my findings without commentary. The weeks blurred together. The siege continued. The Death Corps advanced, retreated, regrouped, and advanced again, suffering losses that should have annihilated them but never did. The reinforcement schedules maintained perfect rhythm. The medical ledgers continued listing reallocations. The supply depot received regular shipments of pre-deployment reserve assets. Everything functioned exactly as designed. I began to notice small inconsistencies in my own records, dates I could not recall, entries in my handwriting that I did not remember making, audits I had apparently completed but had no memory of performing. The gaps were minor, easily attributed to exhaustion or distraction, but they accumulated. I started checking my ledger more frequently, verifying that the previous day's work had actually been done. It always had been. The records were flawless. I simply could not remember creating them. I stopped trying to remember. Memory was not required, only function. The summons arrived without warning. A courier delivered it to my billet during the night shift. The message was brief, written on standard Munitorum letterhead. I was instructed to report to the Command Headquarters Administrative Annex at dawn for a clearance review. The tone was neutral. The language was procedural. There was no indication of disciplinary action, but there was also no explanation of purpose. I did not sleep. I sat at my desk and reviewed my recent work, searching for errors that might have triggered scrutiny. I found none. My audits were thorough. My documentation was precise. I had maintained my duties without deviation. If there was a problem, it was not in my performance. At dawn, I walked to the headquarters complex. The annex was a small building tucked behind the main command bunker, used primarily for personnel processing and administrative reviews. I was met by a Munitorum adjutant, a thin man with the kind of bureaucratic bearing that suggested he had never left the rear echelons. He directed me to a windowless office furnished with a single table and 2 chairs. He told me to wait. I waited for 20 minutes. Then a woman entered. She wore the uniform of a senior Munitorum logistics coordinator, her rank insignia indicating authority over theater-wide supply operations. She carried a data slate and a sealed folder. She sat across from me. She did not introduce herself. She activated the data slate and scrolled through several screens, her expression neutral. She told me that my service record had been reviewed. She told me that my performance had been exemplary. She told me that my contributions to casualty reconciliation and logistical continuity had been noted by senior administrators. She told me that I was being commended for diligence and precision. Then she told me that my clearance level had exceeded safe parameters for non-essential cognition. I did not speak. She continued. She explained that certain categories of information, while not classified as restricted, carried what she termed cognitive risk when processed without appropriate contextual containment. My work had exposed me to data patterns that, while individually unremarkable, created cumulative psychological strain when observed in aggregate. This was not a failure on my part. It was a predictable outcome of extended exposure to specialized logistics frameworks. She told me that the administratum had protocols for managing such exposure. She told me that I would be reassigned to a rear echelon archival annex, where my expertise could be utilized in a less operationally intensive context. She told me this was not punitive. It was protective. The Imperium valued its servants and sought to preserve their capacity for continued service. She opened the sealed folder and removed a small data slate. She placed it on the table between us. She told me it contained a memory-anchoring catechism, a devotional framework designed to provide cognitive structure during periods of transitional stress. She told me I was required to recite it daily as part of my new duties. The recitation would help prevent what she termed associative drift, the tendency for isolated data points to form speculative connections that undermined operational focus. She told me this gently, as if offering a kindness. I looked at the data slate. I looked at her. I asked if I could continue my current assignment. She said no. I asked if the reassignment was permanent. She said that would depend on my adjustment to the new role. I asked what would happen if I refused. She said refusal was not an option. She said this without threat, without emphasis. It was simply a statement of procedural fact. She stood. She told me to finalize any outstanding audit documentation within the next 48 hours. She told me that my replacement would arrive at the end of the week. She told me that my service to the Imperium was appreciated and that my sacrifice, though she did not specify what I had sacrificed, would not be forgotten. She left. I remained in the office, staring at the data slate. I activated it. The screen displayed the opening lines of the catechism. It was written in the formal liturgical Gothic used in official devotionals, dense with layered meaning and theological precision. The first verse was a meditation on the sanctity of duty. The second was a reflection on the limits of mortal comprehension. The third was an invocation of faith in the systems that sustained the Imperium's coherence. I read the entire catechism. It was designed to compartmentalize thought, to isolate individual observations from broader synthesis, to frame obedience as a virtue that transcended understanding. It was, in essence, a tool for forgetting without erasing. Memory would remain, but meaning would dissolve. I closed the data slate. I returned to my billet and began finalizing my audits. The work took 36 hours. I reviewed every outstanding report, cross-referenced every unresolved discrepancy, and ensured that all documentation met administratum standards. The final task was the campaign ledger itself, the master document that tracked all personnel movements, casualties, and resource allocations for the Vraxian theater. I opened it to the current page and began verifying the most recent entries. The Death Corps tallies were flawless. Losses matched forecasts, replacements aligned with projected attrition curves. Operational density remained constant, every number resolved perfectly. I scanned back through previous months. The pattern persisted without variation. I checked older campaigns archived in supplementary files. The same precision, the same balance. I closed the ledger. I placed it in the archival container designated for my successor. I sealed the container and affixed my scribe's seal to the closure. The seal bore my name, my designation, and my certification that all contents had been verified according to sanctioned protocols. It was the last time I would use that seal. I gathered my personal effects. They were minimal: a spare uniform, a copy of the Imperial Infantryman's uplifting primer, a worn devotional text. I packed them in a small satchel and prepared to depart. Before leaving, I glanced at my desk. The data slate containing the memory anchoring catechism sat where I had left it. I picked it up. I activated it. I began to recite. The words were smooth, polished by repetition across centuries. They flowed without requiring thought. They promised structure. They promised peace. They promised that service could continue even when belief had been hollowed out, even when certainty had been replaced by procedural compliance. They promised that I would endure. I recited the catechism 3 times. By the 3rd recitation, the words had begun to feel like my own. The archival annex was located in a fortified sublevel beneath the main munitorum complex, accessible only through a series of checkpoints and lift systems that descended far below the surface. I was escorted by 2 military police who did not speak during the journey. The descent took nearly 20 minutes. When the lift doors opened, I stepped into a corridor lit by pale blue lumens that cast no shadows. The annex itself was vast. Rows upon rows of storage racks stretched into the distance, each rack filled with data slates, parchment scrolls, ledger books, and archival crystals. The air was dry, temperature controlled to preserve the integrity of ancient documents. The only sound was the faint hum of environmental regulators. I saw no other personnel. The MPs directed me to a small workstation near the entrance, then departed. A senior archivist appeared shortly after. He was an elderly man, his face deeply lined, his hands trembling slightly as he held a manifest. He introduced himself as Scribe Secundus Halloran. He told me I would be maintaining attrition templates for Death Corps deployments across multiple theaters. The work involved ensuring that historical loss patterns were accurately preserved and formatted for future reference. It was essential work, he said. The Imperium's strategic planning depended on reliable data. He showed me the templates. They were dense, multi-column documents that tracked casualty rates, replacement schedules, operational durations, and resource consumption across decades of campaigns. Each template was a distillation of thousands of individual deaths, reduced to curves and ratios and forecasting models. My role was to verify their accuracy, cross-reference them against archived records, and update them when new campaign data became available. I asked how often new data arrived. He said constantly. The Death Corps was deployed on hundreds of worlds simultaneously. Every week brought fresh casualty reports, new attrition figures, revised projections. The templates needed constant refinement to maintain their predictive reliability. I asked if I would ever see the campaigns directly. He said no. My work was purely analytical. I would process data from theaters I would never visit, involving regiments I would never meet, in wars I would never witness. The distance was intentional, he explained. It preserved objectivity. He left me at my workstation. I activated the terminal and accessed the template archive. Thousands of files, centuries of war, millions of deaths, all meticulously categorized and formatted for administrative convenience. I selected the first template. It documented the Heracon 9 campaign, a 3-year siege that had consumed 14 Krieg regiments. The attrition curve was smooth, predictable, mathematically elegant. I verified it against archived casualty logs. The numbers matched perfectly. I moved to the next template, then the next. The work was absorbing in its tedium. Each verification required focus, precision, cross-referencing. Hours passed without my noticing. When the shift ended, I saved my progress and logged out. I had completed 7 templates. There were thousands more waiting. I recited the memory anchoring catechism before sleeping. The words came easily now. They erased the faces I had seen in the transit coffins, the names I had removed from ledgers during the reassignment rite, the voice of Commissar Crost explaining that faith required accepting ignorance. The catechism framed my work as sacred, my distance as devotional, my compliance as a form of prayer. I slept without dreaming. The weeks became months. I settled into the rhythm of the annex. I arrived each day, verified templates, cross-referenced data, and logged my progress. The work never ended. New campaigns generated new data. Old campaigns required re-verification as archival standards evolved. The Death Corps continued its endless deployment, suffering losses that I documented but no longer felt. I no longer thought about the underground muster chambers, or the medical reallocations, or the transport coffins filled with sleeping men. Those memories remained, but they had lost their emotional charge. The catechism had done its work. I could recall the details without experiencing their weight. The knowledge persisted as information, detached from meaning. I saw no other scribes. Halloran visited occasionally to deliver new data crystals or collect completed templates, but our interactions were brief and procedural. I ate meals in a small refectory adjacent to the annex, always alone. I slept in a billet even smaller than the one I had occupied at the siege line. The isolation was total, but I did not mind. Isolation simplified things. There was no need to manage conversations, to deflect questions, to maintain the appearance of normalcy. My name was removed from the active scribe roster. I learned this when I attempted to use my old identification seal to authorize a minor supply requisition. The system rejected it. My designation had been changed. I was no longer Scribe Tertius assigned to Vraxian Casualty Reconciliation. I was Archival Function 773 assigned to Template Maintenance. The change had occurred without notification. It did not require my consent. I accepted it. Names were administrative conveniences, functions were what mattered. Years passed. I could not say how many. The annex had no windows, no exposure to natural light or seasonal variation. Time was measured in completed templates, in data updates, in the slow accumulation of verified attrition records. I worked through campaigns I had never heard of, on worlds whose names meant nothing to me. The Death Corps was everywhere. Its losses were constant. Its replenishment was perfect. I noticed that newer templates were more refined than older ones. The forecasting models had improved. Attrition curves could now be predicted with extraordinary precision. Entire campaigns could be planned around the certainty of Krieg's expenditure. The Imperium had learned to weaponize the pattern I had first glimpsed during the reassignment rite. Krieg was no longer just a solution to entropy. It was the foundation of strategic stability. I thought about this occasionally, in the moments between verifications, but the thoughts were abstract. I understood the system without reacting to it. The catechism had stripped away judgment. What remained was pure function. I maintained the templates. The templates enabled the deployment. The deployment sustained the Imperium. My work mattered because the system worked. I no longer remembered why I had felt horror. The memory of horror remained, filed away in some inaccessible part of my mind, but I could not access the emotion that had accompanied it. I had been afraid of something. I had questioned something. The details were vague. What I knew with certainty was that the questioning had ended and the work had continued. The system had not broken me. It had simply incorporated me. I was part of its machinery now, a component that processed data and maintained continuity. I served the Imperium by serving the system that consumed the Imperium's faithful. There was no contradiction. There was only function. One day, though, I could not say which day or in which year, Halloran delivered a data crystal containing updated casualty reports from a recently concluded campaign. He placed it on my desk without comment. I inserted it into my terminal and began the verification process. The campaign was designated Mortis Threshold. Duration, 4 years. Forces deployed, 21 Krieg regiments. Total casualties, 3,800,642. I verified the numbers against historical templates. The attrition curve matched predicted patterns with near-perfect fidelity. Losses had been sustained at a rate that allowed strategic objectives to be met without requiring reinforcement from non-Krieg formations. The campaign had been a success. The system had functioned as designed. I updated the template. I logged the verification. I moved to the next data crystal. The work continued. Sometimes, in the silence between tasks, I thought about the reassignment rite. I remembered standing in the transit chapel, watching Auxilia transformed into Krieg through ritual and paperwork. I remembered the ledger resolving perfectly, despite losses that should have made resolution impossible. I remembered the moment I had first understood that the numbers did not reconcile because they reflected reality, but because reality was made to fit the numbers. I remembered believing that the ledger could not lie. I knew better now. The ledger did not lie because lying required intent. The ledger simply was. It existed as a tool designed to maintain coherence in a system that consumed human beings without acknowledging their humanity. My work ensured that the consumption remained coherent, that the attrition was documented, that the Imperium could look upon its wars and believe it understood the cost. But the cost was not real. The dead were abstractions, the living were functions. The distinction had been erased, not through deception, but through process. The Imperium did not run on lies. It ran on systems that made truth irrelevant. I was part of that system now. I maintained the templates that enabled the deployments that generated the casualties that I then verified and archived. The loop was closed, perfect, self-sustaining. The death corps marched endlessly in my records. They died in numbers I could calculate but no longer comprehend. They were replaced with precision I could verify but no longer questioned. They existed as a resource that replenished itself through mechanisms I was not permitted to see and no longer wished to understand. I recited the catechism. The words were smooth. The words were true. The words absolved nothing. But they made continuation possible. I had been seconded to the Munitorum to document the death corps of Krieg. I had learned what they were. I had learned what I was. And in learning, I had been absorbed into the same system that had absorbed them. There was no escape. There was no redemption. There was only the work, and the work continued. The annex remained silent, except for the hum of environmental regulators and the faint click of data processing. I sat at my workstation, surrounded by centuries of death reduced to numbers, and I verified the next template. The campaign was unfamiliar. The world was unknown to me. The casualties were enormous. The numbers resolved perfectly. I logged the verification. I archived the update. I prepared the next template. The Imperium endured. The Death Corps endured. I endured. And the ledger, flawless and absolute, absolved nothing.